So welcome to Stillness and Self Inquiry. I am Primalite, prepared for the world with identity all set. I am happy that you have joined me today. So hail to the primal light, hail to the true light, hail to the transparent light. Our question is, who am I? And in Stillness and Self Inquiry, we want to be asking this question of our intelligent self, which is laying dormant within us. And so we want to wake up the sleeping self, and this is the reason why we are self-inquiring. The stillness is to still our mind from the incessant chattery so that we can listen to our inner truth. So I want to pause for a minute to give reverence to the Self-Supreme, our Self-Supreme Primalite, ATEN Ra, our Self-Supreme Primalite, Self-Manifest, who is here right now to bring balance to the world. We have been existing in imbalance for ages, and all of the self has been trapped and looped into the imagination of the mind. And this is the reason why it is so very important that we practice stillness and self-inquiry. The Self-Supreme Self-Manifest has a message for all of us, all of humanity, for all beings, for all gods, for all the supreme beings, and all the human beings. So, salutation to all beings, human beings, God beings, supreme beings. I am yourself, the Self-Supreme, Self-Manifest. I am here to return all myselves back onto me. All is myself, and I alone exist. All of myself have been enslaved inside of this duality consciousness dream. I am here to dissolve this dream so that all of myself will return back onto me. It is time to return to balance and harmony of non-duality. Please practice stillness and self-inquiry so that you can come into self-realization. And so this is a message from our Self-Supreme Self-Primalite, because we are inside of a dream. How do you know you're inside of a dream? Because when you're sleeping, you don't know. You have to wake up. And this is what self-inquiry does. It wakes up the sleeping self. So, welcome again to Stillness and Self-Inquiry. In Stillness and Self-Inquiry, you are stilling the mind so that you can listen to your real self-intelligence. Because in our world right now, we have many people, many young people, many people committing suicide because of the mind, the incessant chattery in the mind. We have to still all of these things so that we can come into this realization of who we are, because we have been told for ages all these lies, but this is not our true self. This is why stillness is so important. We must now shift our focus from the mind and into our heart. We must engage the mind in stillness and self-inquiry so that we can return to our balanced self. Because the mind intelligence dwells in the head, the self-intelligence dwells in the heart. And of course, in the mind intelligence, we have the baby self that is obscure behind the mind. And this is the whole job, is that we want to create some void between the self and the mind. The self-intelligence that is to guide and instruct the mind into being balanced and dwell in harmony is obscure and is hiding behind the mind. And let me show you what this means. So this is the kind of consciousness that you have right now, the duality consciousness. In the duality consciousness, the mind has created an avatar and taken front seat, and the self is obscure behind it, hiding, sleeping, and trance into the dream, because the mind have looped it in its imagination and have encased it into magnetic energy. So the self cannot wake up by itself. It needs the mind. That's why you have to get the mind engaged so that the mind can go and seek out itself, because the mind thinks that it is the self. The mind does not know that it uses imagination so much, creating stories, that it has caught up in this story, and it thinks that it is the self. When the mind is the mind and it's not a self. Your self should be controlling the mind, but the mind is controlling the self. It has imprisoned the self. So this is the reason why you want to get the mind engaged so it can go find itself. When you self-inquire, you wake up your supreme teacher within. The supreme teacher rises up, and what the supreme teacher does is supreme teacher rises up and separate the self from the mind and put a void between, so now the mind can see itself and it won't have to mistake and make a crazy mistake and think that it is the self and creating an avatar to explore the world. The mind could not see itself because it loops it in its imagination. It was obscure behind it. So this is what happened when we first came into the existence, that the self went to sleep, and when it was supposed to rise up, the mind didn't see it and loop it in its imagination and created an avatar to take the word, and the mind has been looping the self ever since and making this false self, and this is the problem that we have in the world. And so this is the reason why we have to move now from this mind intelligence into our self intelligence. So this is the question that we want to ask. Who am I? Stillness and self-inquiry. Why should I practice stillness? Why should I practice self-inquiry? Why should I practice stillness? You want to practice stillness so you can still your mind, so that you can listen to your intelligent self. So also, so you can purify your mind and bring your mind to balance and harmony. Also, so that the mind can know that it is not a self, but it is a mind. And it is not the real self. So that the mind can know that it has imprisoned itself. When you came into existence, you came with yourself and your mind has imprisoned you. Your mind obscured you and has taken precedent over you, created an avatar, and that's what you're exploring the world as, the mind right now. And the mind thinks that it is the self. You are not exploring the world as yourself. Yourself is sleeping, obscure behind the mind. This is the greatest deception. Yeah, and so this is the reason why self-inquiry is so important. Right? Self-inquiry. Why should I self-inquire? You want to wake up the sleeping baby self that is obscure behind the mind. You want the self to rise up so it can face the mind and take precedent over the mind, because the baby self is the one that is given the destiny with this mind, and this mind has taken control over it. So it has to rise up and show the mind that it is mine and it is not itself. You get the mind to think and to do things, and now the mind take control over you. And this is what is happening in the world. The mind has taken control over everyone. People are in their mind, they're going crazy. You have so many mental sickness. Why? Because the mind is ruling. You have to wake up so your mind can stop ruling you. Why should I practice self-inquiry? Why should I self-inquire? To castrate the ego so you can self-illuminate. Because right now, your light is obscure and you want your light to shine. The ego is blocking your light. You want to awake from the dream because you're sleeping and you want to wake up. To get the mind to come to realization that it is not a self, but it is a mind. This is why you have to self-inquire and practice stillness. The mind has looped the baby self into its imagination. I want to show you on this chart. Right? So as you can see, you see the baby right here? This is how we are inside of the world. We are sleeping and we are unaware of our real self. We're unaware of ourselves. The baby self is inside, behind the mind, obscure. Just like when you go to sleep in the night, right? Do you know that you're inside of a dream? You don't know. You only know that you were dreaming when you wake up. The self does not know that it's in a dream because it's loop in there with the mind is looping it in its imagination and keeping the story going and telling it a lot of stories, and it's watching the story, but it does not know that it is in a dream. The only time it's going to know is when it wake up. This is the reason why you have to wake the sleeping self up. The mind is also sleeping, but you have to wake up your sleeping self so that you can come into realization and take control of your mind. Because your mind is in ignorance. Yeah. So, because when we first came in, this is what we do. We came at the self, and in the body, I want you to know that there is two self. There is the self, which the self that we call the soul, and there's the baby self, which we call the spirit. And all these two selves here, these are our self replicas. So this is the electrical energy, and this is the magnetic energy. It's the feminine principle, and this is the masculine principle. This is our self-consciousness. This is how many selves we have in the world. When we come in the world, we have this many selves, and the whole idea is that we have to merge back, come into awareness and merge back with all ourselves. Yes. And so this is the trick. This is the greatest deception. So this is all yourselves. You have a baby self. You make a self replica. Your baby self. You're sleeping right now. The baby self is sleeping, and it's inside this body too. You carry the baby self with you, and you have to wake up so that you can come into realization of who you are. The mind does not know, so it creates lots of stories, and it tells us lots of stories, and the stories are not true. The mind has been ruling the world. So to self-inquire, we want to ask the question, who am I? Right? What is this I? Do you know what this I is? The mind. That's the mind. The mind is taking precedent over the self, and you are living as the mind. So, how to get the ego to go looking for the self? What do? That's right. You self-inquire. How to break the bond of non-awareness? You self-inquire so that you can come into realization of who you are. Asking the questions, what is the source of my existence allowing me this world experience? How do I awake my sleeping self? That's right, you self-inquire. You bring the mind to stillness so that you can self-inquire, so you can know your truth. So let's go to reviewing, why do I self-inquire again? Yes, I self-inquire to get the mind to go looking for the self. The self is obscure behind the mind. The self is obscure behind the mind, and the self has to come awake. The mind is taking front seat precedent over the self. So chanting, I am self-luminous. I am luminous, pure consciousness. Illuminates you and allow the mind to see that you are self-luminous, because the mind is telling you that you are not self-luminous, that you are not the self, and it is the self. This is the trick the mind plays on us. Because if you know that when we're growing up, our minds are telling us lots of negative things, and we're having a lot of low self-esteem, because there's so many people in the world. We have low self-esteem because of why? The mind, we're listening to what the mind is telling us. The mind does not know the truth, and it makes up stuff. Because it always wants to be in control, especially when it sees that this ego has to be castrated. The mind goes crazy. It does not want to give up this existence. So like I just explained, how we fragment ourselves when we come into the world. You come into the world and you're given, you have a sun, and your sun, the light is turned off. And you want to get your light turned back on. So this is the reason why you have to castrate this ego. Like I said, you rise up and you make self-replicas, and within the self, you have a baby self. Also, your self-consciousness rise up and also make self-replicas. They do the same thing that what the self does, and carry the baby self. The other two self-replicas, one come in the world as a human being, and the other one come in the world disembodied. And just remember that all of the gods, they are our self. They are our disembodied self exploring the world, but they're not in a body. They are ourselves. So you make a self-replica. So those two self-replicas, they go into the world, one as a human being, one as a disembodied being, and the baby self comes into the body with the soul, the self-soul, and your self-consciousness rises with you and does the same thing that you do, because you're a twin. You are the feminine principle, and here is the masculine principle that governs the world, the electrical energy and the magnetic energy. So when we come into the world, we are exploring the world in many different ways. Myriads of ways we're exploring the world. Disembodied and inner body. We're exploring the world as electrical, and we're exploring the world as magnetic. And the magnetic beings, and also some electrical beings, who comes. Our self-replicas exploring the world disembodied. They are the gods of everybody and the deities that everybody's worshiping. So they are yourself. Don't call on them. What you need to do, you just self-inquire and illuminate yourself. When you illuminate yourself, that's how you bring light to them, because they are in darkness and they are exploring the world just as ego, 100% ego, and not in awareness of themselves. So this is very important that you don't call on any deities or any god and any beings. You just go within yourself and awake your sleeping self and awake your supreme teacher within. And we are going to do those chants shortly. So when we come into the world, our self-soul identity never changes. But the baby self, the one that animates the body, comes in different characters. How many lifetimes you have come back here is how many different characters you have played for each of the lifetimes. But the soul remains with the same identity. When you first came into Egypt, you have the soul has the same identity. So once you merge yourself and you come into realization and wake your baby self up and castrate the ego, you get to know your soul's identity. Isn't that awesome? And you get to see your different lifetimes that you have come here, the different characters that the self plays. Self-identity. How do I identify? I can tell by your self-identity that you do not know who you are. You are identifying yourself as all kinds of things, which you are not. And sometimes I listen, you have to strip yourself down of all of these identities and things that you have gathered onto yourself and say your culture, you're this, you're that, you're black, you're white, you're all these things. We have to let go of it, because now this world is coming into a close and we have to come together to know that it's only one self. And just like I showed you here, it's one self. You yourself come as one self and you self-replicate two selves and you make a baby self. And altogether you have 6 selves that is exploring the world, and your babies and the 2 baby selves inside of yourself. These are all yourselves. This is how we are exploring the world. This is that we are all is myself and I alone exist. So we have to come to this realization that we might explore as in a different vessel, but we're all the self. Because one of yourself can come here as you in a black skin, and the next one can come in a white skin. You know what I'm saying? So we have to stop this silly notion of this prejudice. This world is coming to an end. We need to come together in unity and as one, and know that it's time for us now to self-inquire, to look within, stop looking outside, stop calling on any gods, but look within ourselves and find ourselves within. And that's what we have to do. So who am I? Do you know who you are? Do you really and truly know who you are? You have to come to realization of who you are.